Production funding for Behind the Headlines is made possible in part by the WKNO Production Fund, the WKNO Endowment Fund, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
Memphis 3.0 and the future of the city, tonight on Behind the Headlines. I'm Eric Barnes, publisher of the Memphis Daily News. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined tonight by Ashley Cash, an urban planner and the administrator of Memphis 3.0. Thanks for being here again. John Zena, Deputy Director of the Office of Planning, and we'll talk about some of the other things you're involved in, but thank you for being here again.
Thank you.
And Eric Robertson is President of Community Lift. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
So Ashley, we were talking a little before the show, we had you on first about November of last year. Memphis 3.0 had been recently announced, you had been recently hired, and there are many phases to this. But for people who don't necessarily aren't as close to it, we write about it quite a bit. But I think of Memphis 3.0, and you can correct me because I'll probably get a bunch of this wrong. But it's kind of a master plan for the city, right? A strategic plan for a city. So if people are involved in their churches or their schools or a company or a nonprofit, they'll do maybe a 5-year plan. This is more of a multi-decade plan to look at transportation, to look at land use, and all those kinds of issues. Yes. Okay. Yes. So with that in mind, and we'll kind of pick through all the various parts of it. Jumping forward a little bit, you've finished a couple of phases. You're about to finish the second phase of community input and community feedback, meeting with community groups all around, neighborhood groups.
Right.
What have you learned?
That's a great question. So we've spent a lot of time just gathering background information, trying to talk with the public, see where they are on a lot of issues, researching and learning and understanding what previous plans have done, maybe neighborhood level project-based plans. And we've learned a number of things. We've learned a lot about the challenges that our community faces in terms of maybe like transportation, in terms of job access, in terms of infrastructure improvements. We've also learned a lot in terms of where the marketability of our future is headed. And so a lot of that is going to be growth concentrated in sort of around the Poplar corridor out to the edges of the city. Those are sort of the major findings and takeaways. And then as planners, we also always like to ask, what are the assets, what are the strengths, what are some things we can all come around as a city? And from there, we've learned, people are saying it's the people of the city, it's the heart, the soul of the city, and then also our green spaces, open spaces, and connection to nature.
And how many meetings have you done, give or take?
That's a great question. Yeah, a lot. We've got a lot of public meetings that we host ourselves. We do a lot of what we call pop-up engagements, and that's where you'll find us at different festivals like the Levitt Shell Festival, the Fraser Spring Festival, and so forth. But then also we get a lot of invitations from neighborhood groups, a couple of hospitals have invited us out. And so there's a ton of meetings. I could kind of go through and give you a ballpark number. I would say probably close to 50 at this point, but it continuously increases. Okay.
And we'll talk a little bit about some of the next steps and where it goes from here, because it's all moving towards a 2019 rollout. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. But I'll switch to you, John. You were on, I think, when right after Ashley was hired. Your thoughts on how Memphis 3.0 is progressing, and then let's get into what you hope comes of it, and what other cities who've done these sort of planning processes, what has come of it in other places.
Sure. To this point, like Ashley said, we've spent the last several months doing a lot of listening, getting ideas, getting feedback, really hearing where a lot of people are in terms of where they see the city and their ideas for the city. We've also done a lot of research, whether it's brought in some outside teams to help us with that market research that Ashley mentioned, or whether it's the staff doing research on different factors related to the plan. We're at a point now where we've presented a lot of those key findings. There were 3 meetings in late June where we presented a lot of those findings, and we're transitioning to the point where we've got to make some decisions. We've really got to understand, do we have it right in terms of the way that the process is reading the values of the city and of the people, and in terms of where we're headed as a city, what are the decisions that we need to make with respect to the areas where we want to see growth, the areas where we want to see investment, and what does that look like? What we know is, like Ashley said, there are a lot of indicators towards a continued growth along the Poplar Corridor and along the edge of the city. We've seen that for years, and what the research is telling us is that we'll continue to see it again should we do nothing. And the central question I think that Ashley was trying to pose to the public last month in those key findings meetings is that what we want for our future for the city? And we've got a chance in the next couple of months working with the public in the venues that Ashley talked about, and then another round of public meetings to pose that question and think about, where are the areas that we want to see that growth and that investment, and how does that affect those things that we have articulated as a community that we value, like access to jobs or access to transit? How well does continuing growth in the way that we have, or how poorly does it allow us to improve transportation access, job access, economic mobility? Or are there different scenarios in which we could grow as a city that would see greater outcomes for those things that we value? So that's kind of where the process has been, and where I see it going in the next couple of months. And what I want to see from it overall is, that foundation needs to ultimately lead to a land use plan, a set of recommendations, a set of strategies, a set of rules about if this is the vision that we articulate as a community, whether it be the public, government, nonprofits, for-profits, this is the vision that we all agree on. How do we get there? Yeah. And how do we get there in the time frame that we've allotted, and not let certain things sort of just fall by the wayside? And I think that discipline is what's so important to making sure that we achieve those objectives long term.
And so in those objectives and the things that are defined by the plan, I mean, Memphis 3.0 isn't going to implement all those. I mean, Ashley's not going to implement everything that comes in the plan. Right. The city, to whatever extent the county, there are certain things that they would do. But some of it, is it fair to say, it's existing organizations and a kind of blueprint for how they might work and how they might fit into it? Yeah,
absolutely. One of the things that we started saying early on is, we have gotten the question, at the end of this planning process, is there like a big pot of money, at the end of the rainbow? Right. And the answer is no, there's not. But the good news is there's money spent every day in our community. Right. And by further investing in our community, we hope that even more money is spent in our community. And that's money spent not only by government, but by the private sector, by the nonprofit sector. Right. And so what we're trying to do with Memphis 3.0 is to come up with a common vision that sets a set of rules in place and a set of expectations in place that we're all following, that government's following, that the private sector, that we're asking the private sector to follow, that we're hoping nonprofits follow, philanthropy and so on, so that we've got that vision that we're all working towards that's common among all of those entities.
Right. And so, Eric Robertson, I'll bring you in, because that's in part, I think you're one of those groups who you're not only, you're involved in the process now, I think you're on the advisory council to the Memphis 3.0 plan, but Community Lift, which we'll talk about what it does, it will be implementing ostensibly some of these things that are coming together through this planning process. Is that fair?
That's what we hope, not just Lift, but obviously us and a host of other organizations. I think, as John has said, we believe that if this work is to be successful, it's going to have to take a collective effort, and there has to be a space in here where the business community sees what's their role to implement, philanthropic community, how are they aligning their resources, nonprofits, how are we aligning our programs, as well as government entities, how are we being strategic to carry out this plan that has created, for the first time, I will say in a long time, hopefully, a shared vision that we can all get behind.
So tell people what Community Lift does and how long it's been around.
It's been around for just over 5 years now officially. The simple answer is we facilitate and connect CDCs, residents, and businesses to resources. And we think
CDCs are
Community Development Corporation, sorry.
No, that's right.
And we think about resources in 4 ways, or in terms of capital, we think about 4 ways we think about capital. We say we connect them to financial capital. So we provide loans actually to some small businesses located in neighborhoods. We help to build and provide intellectual capital. So ideas, planning. We've supported the planning process in previous neighborhoods. We help to provide human capital, so we have a network of organizations to provide volunteers that can help with particular efforts. And then lastly, we support social capital between residents being engaged and advocating and moving together for their communities.
So as we talk about this, and I'm kind of fixated on this for a little bit, which is how 3.0 works with all the existing organizations. For instance, I mean, last week we had, or recently, I can't remember exactly when it was, we had Memphis Beautiful and the Blight people on. We've done shows about, in the past, about de-annexation. We've done shows, you know, we've talked about urban art before. We've talked about bike lanes and transportation and Greenprint, which, you know, John Zena has obviously been heavily involved in. How much is these efforts of nonprofits, of philanthropies, how much are you aware of that as you go through this process, saying that's a place where this nonprofit or this group might be working on an island and they could kind of fit into this whole vision? Yeah. Is that part of what you're trying to...
That's a really great point. That's one of the purposes or reasons behind having a comprehensive citywide plan or having a long-range plan, is that it really gives you sort of an avenue to collect and pull all of those different ideas or all of those different possibly projects and solutions. And so a lot of that, we have knowledge of what's going on. As we were walking in, Eric was just talking about another process in a different neighborhood that we need to be aware of. And so we'll have knowledge of the different planning efforts, the different groups like Clean Memphis or like MPI that are working specifically on blight or a specific issue. But then also we've got a network of partners that say exactly that. You know, you need to really be talking to this person because they're doing X, Y, Z as it relates to maybe transportation improvement, and it really aligns, or I think it aligns with what you're doing. And so that's where our staff, having sort of deep connections into these neighborhood organizations and these nonprofit agencies and continuing to build and facilitate those relationships. Right. We've got a number of working groups through this process, and so a lot of those working groups are made up of people who have been working on different issues like you've talked about, blight, workforce development, et cetera. And so it makes sense that those different objectives or those different strategies are aligned with this process. But we also have to keep in mind that the comprehensive plan can't be all things to all people. And so we've got a specific lane that we try to stay in as it relates to land use infrastructure. How does the built environment improve conditions related to crime or public safety? How does the built environment support existing schools? And so that's where our expertise really comes in to say, you're working in your specific area, but how does the built environment and what does our plans and policies say about the way that operates?
And that part, and thank you for correcting me that it's Clean Memphis, not Memphis Beautiful. I don't have no Bill Dries today to fact check me, so you can fill that role, and I appreciate that very much. But it was interesting to talk to them about that relationship between blight and a clean neighborhood and crime. Yeah. And Christopher Blank from WKNO-FM was on, and he was talking about a series of stories he did where, you know, people in the neighborhood say, look, I can tell you where the crime's going to start. It's where all the trash is. So that these things, which I think somebody who listened to what you just said went, wait, how do we go from transportation and land use to crime? But those things are interrelated, correct? I mean, they're deep connections. They're complicated, but there are deep connections.
Yeah, there are connections, there are correlations that can be made, and through a lot of research and through a lot of on-the-ground talking to people, you understand how these different factors play into each other.
Can I was going to say, you know, one of the ways I think ultimately the best opportunity for this to be really interwoven throughout the community is a lot of people will have to take ownership of the plan. Eric Burns, you would have to take ownership, and someone's on the show and you say, you know, how does this align to Memphis 3.0? People applying to grants, to foundations, they need to be asking in their grant application, how does this align to Memphis 3.0? Businesses coming into the city of Memphis through the Chamber and Edge, they need to look at that and say, how does this align to Memphis 3.0? And so once we get this kind of systematic adoption and ownership of the plan, then that's how we then will get it interwoven throughout all the myriad of organizations throughout the city.
Well, and that's a good segue to Greenprint, right? I mean, for me, because we've had you on the show before talking about Greenprint, we've certainly written about it, and other papers have as well, that Greenprint, which is a, you know, kind of big picture vision of how, of new greenways, of new bike lanes, and how those connect to existing parks, be it Shelby Farms, be it Overton Park, be it Riverside, I mean, all the different parks in town. And that gives a kind of vision of what are these parks, what are the Wolf River Conservancy, what are they going to do so that they're not operating in isolation, they have some sort of big picture plan of how all these green spaces interrelate. Is that a fair analogy to what Eric just said?
Yeah, and I'll add on just you know, what Eric was talking about is actually what, when Ashley and I were on last, what Frank Ricks was talking about, which is building a culture of planning. That is something that this process it needs to have as one of the key outcomes, is building that culture of planning. And that was one of the things that I think Greenprint really got us started on. You know, before we started the Greenprint planning process, you had several, a collection of nonprofit organizations who, all sort of had their niche, their project that they were working on, their area they were working on. But typically, really kind of zeroed down into a specific, mile or 2 miles of trail or a single park. And they kind of came together as a collective and said, this project isn't going to really be special unless we're able to connect it to this greater network. And I think that was the opening for Greenprint, and ultimately the reason why the county, pulling together all of those partners, applied for the HUD funding, and we got the HUD funding to do that regional grant. And one of the outcomes of that was not only to create that sort of plan for a network that ultimately the Shelby Farms Park and the Wolf River Greenway and the Green Line and so on all connects to, but it also started that process of building that culture of planning across these different groups, across these different communities, in a way that we're hoping to leverage and build on and do more and do better with Memphis 3.0. And in the same way, so that whether you're a neighborhood organization that's got a project that you're really passionate about, and you're hoping that it's going to address blight or address some vacancy in your neighborhood surrounding that project, whether it's maybe a park or something like that. Ultimately, that project is stronger by being sort of a key component of what the overall vision of the city is with Memphis 3.0. So I think this is a great chance for all of those different players to kind of come together in this space, not having to give up, what is sort of their community identity, but seeing how their community fits into this larger whole and this larger vision for where we're headed as a city. And I think that's something that obviously we've been missing since the 1981 plan, and maybe even missing, even before then, but a real opportunity for us to set that vision that we can all agree on, that sees how all these communities connect to that.
Yeah, and so I'm curious if for you, I don't turn to you all, but the two grocery stores that are going in areas that haven't had grocery stores. So Binghamton is now getting a grocery store. It's under construction, and announced fairly recently that Fraser's getting a grocery store, and it's been a food desert, and those are issues that really impact how people live. That is not related to Memphis 3.0, but it's the kind of thing down the road you'd like to see come out of Memphis 3.0 potentially, right? That these are areas of development. You talked about where EDGE works. Well, EDGE is doing this community tax incentive plan to help get that Fraser grocery store started. Is that a fair example of the kind of things you hope coming out down the road from Memphis?
I think that's an example of one solution or type of solution. Grocery stores end up being very tricky in particular because when you start talking to folks, everybody wants a grocery store.
Everyone's
and it's
it might be questionable if Fraser was a food desert because there are a couple of grocery stores already there.
Right.
Point.
And so that's part of our process and part of the background. And we start with conversations with the public, but we continue those throughout the process. And so it might be understanding, well, research says this, but you have conversations with people who are already existing in the neighborhood to say exactly what Eric says. I don't know why they called us a food desert, but that's an example of when you talk with people, when you look at the data, when you look at trends and existing issues and existing opportunity areas, then you can come up with some sort of solution. And it might be a short term, 1 year, it may take 1 year, whatever that solution is, it may take 5 years. But without a plan or a process in place to have and facilitate those conversations, you may not get to that place that Binghamton or Fraser has gotten to.
Another, maybe an example, because I'm just trying to make sure all this stuff is real tangible.
Right.
Because sometimes we talk about this stuff, and I mean, I went to the meeting, but one of the last meetings you did with Brooks, and it was very tangible. But I just want to make sure that we get to it's not these esoteric ideas; it's these kind of tangible things that happen. Is what's going on in the Memphis Medical District a kind of example of planning? It's certainly an example of urban planning. So if people haven't driven through there lately, you can visibly see changes in the streetscape, in urban art that's gone up, in the opening of new stores and new coffee shops and so on. And that was done by the stakeholders in there, the hospitals and the university and others who said, let's transform this place. We need some change done. Is that an example of the kind of thing that could come out in other neighborhoods that could come out of Memphis 3.0?
Yes, absolutely. So things like infill development, you might talk with someone and they may say their neighborhood hasn't had a certain type of development or hasn't had development in a number of years, or they may say there's high vacancy, there's a lot of vacancy, and immediately it goes to the solution of, well, how do we bring people back into the neighborhood, or how do we begin to build up those vacant areas or create them into parks, whatever that ends up being. But you have to have that dialogue and figure out what that solution is. You have to have the stakeholders, like you talked about, and then you have to have folks who are dedicated to continuing to make sure that vision comes to fruition. And I think, like you said, the medical center is a great example. I also think Soulsville, where Lyft works, is another great example of just an area where stakeholders have come together. They see what their weaknesses are, but then also what their opportunities are, and then in sort of a stepwise fashion, work on those to develop solutions for the area.
I would like to.
Yeah, go ahead, John.
I was just going to add, just to kind of like bottom line, I think what we're talking about here is, what we're trying to do is understand how we create markets in these places. Because, when going back to the market study that Ashley mentioned from the beginning, one of the things that just kind of like floored us was, for the most part, if you break down the city into districts, there were maybe 4 of 14 districts where 95% of new housing, new retail, new office space was forecasted over the next 25 years in those 4 of 14 districts. And there were some districts where there was hardly anything forecasted in terms of new development. Some of those districts were areas where we see the highest levels of vacancy, the highest levels of blight. That's the kind of trajectory that, through a comprehensive plan, we're trying to change. That potential future. We're trying to create markets in those areas that have been areas of disinvestment for decades, so that we can get new opportunities like a grocery store or new retail, like is happening in the medical district. It's complicated in every place, and it's a different solution for every place too. But I think the opportunity here is to understand, how do we get sort of the right rules in place to be able to drive, development in certain places or limit it in certain places. How do we get the right incentives, the right strategies, the right subsidies in place to be able to make development in certain communities that have been disinvested for some time a little bit more attractive. It's for somebody like a CDC to take the risk to go in, like Binghamton CDC is doing now with the grocery store, to take that first leap to do that complex project
and bring in private partners the way they did, and bring in
private
neighborhoods.
Partners.
That's kind of
and then ultimately
the kind of things
make
about.
a market that's more attractive to private capital to come in, so that we can start seeing new rooftops and new opportunities in those areas.
You were going to say.
What I was going to say, and I know they've done a great job of bringing it at the practical level, but I think we can't forget that at a high strategic level, it's not just developing the medical district because we need to develop the medical district. It needs to be, we're developing the medical district because we have a larger economic strategy of health, and this ties into our larger economic strategy of health. We are investing in Elvis Presley in Whitehaven because we have a larger strategy of tourism. And so these larger strategies and priorities, which we hope will come out of the planning process, then guides the level of investment strategies that we're doing, so that we're not randomly pursuing initiatives. One of the reasons why we are even having a Memphis 3.0 conversation, Lyft had the privilege of being a part of the early stages of really galvanizing people around moving forward with this, is that we needed to not be randomly doing things, but thinking about how do these things connect to a overall direction that we're trying to move the city in. And right now, that's not very clear. If a company comes, we welcome you, but it's not necessarily a part of our strategic plan, and we hope to change that.
Yeah. I mean, again, thinking about working in isolation, and I've mentioned before on the show that I'm on the board, I guess I'm president of the board of the Overland Park Conservancy, and Greenprint, back to that, just as an example, that helped guide some of our decision making. How would we connect to Binghamton, and how would we connect to bike lanes that are coming in? How would we make certain decisions about, not just in isolation, like what do people really want in the park? Well, they want picnic tables, or they want a pavilion or whatever, but they also want ways to get there, and Greenprint, kind of laid out this roadmap for that at a kind of high level. In terms of the meetings you've done so far, we have just a couple minutes left here. Biggest surprises, some things people wouldn't be surprised about. Some of the things we've talked about. We've talked a lot. People talk a lot about poor transportation. Talk about blighted areas. Talk about areas that have been depopulated, north and south. Economic inequality. So some of those things were known, although I imagine you got definition to it and so on. But some of the surprises you've heard from people.
Well, really, surprises isn't necessarily the word I would use, but just what you would think when talking with people, depending on your area, depending on what access you have to opportunity, is really going to structure what you see as a challenge or what you see as an emergent need. And so a lot of that really was around, when you think about transportation, people who were closer to the core talked a lot about efficiency and frequency. People who were much further out talked about options and things like parking rides. And so it was just pleasant to hear the conversation, I guess, around the differences in areas where we are.
Okay, and I messed up the time because we are out of time. I thought we had a little bit more than we did. I apologize, but that is all the time we have. Join us again next week. Thanks.